Okay, well, I guess we shall start. Hello and welcome everyone to a webinar session as part of the EU Values webinar series. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator, and today we're honoured to welcome Dr. Sam Varvastian as our main presenter. Dr. Varvastian is a lecturer in law at Cardiff University, specialising in climate change law, environmental human rights, and planetary justice. He is the author of the book Human Rights Approaches to Planetary Crises, From Climate Change to Plastic Pollution, in which he explores the complex intersections between human rights frameworks and pressing environmental challenges. We're really excited to hear more about this research today. And this afternoon, he'll be presenting his insights, shedding light on how human rights can inform and transform our response to crises. And our discussant for today's session is Professor Sara Seck, a Professor of Law and Associate Dean at Dalhousie University. She holds the Yogis and Keddy Chair in Human Rights Law and is also the Director of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute of Dalhousie. She is an internationally recognised expert in environmental law, business, human rights and sustainability, and so we're really pleased to have her perspectives and learn from both her and Sam today. I encourage all of you to take this opportunity to engage with their work and their ideas. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. And well, if you like today's webinar or any of our work, we'd be very grateful if you could support the EU Values Network by subscribing or following us online. We're on most social media platforms now. And if you would like a more extensive account of what we get up to, you can go to our website and sign up there to our mailing list. We have a quarterly newsletter. And well, that's all from me. I'm very delighted to now hand over to Dr. Sam Varvastian, for his presentation. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. I will just share my screen then. Okay, is that all good? Can you see the slides?
Yes, perfect. You're all good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily, for introducing me, and thank you obviously to the EU Values Network for inviting me to talk about my work, and of course a massive thanks to Sarah for being the discussant. Now, probably the very first thing that I should say when talking about the human rights approaches to environmental issues is that in general, the application of human rights mechanisms when dealing with environmental harms has a very long history. And in fact, it has been recognized at the international level for more than 50 years now. It has been in place in many countries as part of their domestic case law. It has been in place in international treaty bodies and courts. And as a general rule, we know that environmental degradation can lead to human rights violations. But the key thing is that historically, when we discuss those different human rights mechanisms in the context of environmental degradation, we normally think about, well, shall we say, more localized types of environmental harms. Like, let's just say you live close to a place where your neighbor is involved in maybe, let's just say, smelting, or maybe let's just say some kind of factory, or maybe let's just say just an animal farm. And whatever they do there, whatever pollution they cause there affects you, then you might want to seek remedies. Sometimes you might want to seek remedies in, let's just say, in civil laws, such as tort, but sometimes you might want to seek remedies in human rights if, for example, the government, if the regulatory authorities are not doing what they should be doing about regulating this pollution. But then we get, obviously, to the larger scale, larger magnitude, global environmental harms, and that's where things become all of a sudden much more complicated. Because now we're not just talking about local scale here and now, but we are talking about countless and countless of sources of pollutants. Like, let's just say in case of greenhouse gas emissions, we have pretty much, well, those emissions everywhere, right? And we have the impacts of climate change everywhere. So it's a very transboundary problem. It's no longer something localized. It's a very global thing in its magnitude. things such as plastic pollution, again, something very simple because you have countless sources of pollutants from pretty much everywhere around the globe, and you have billions and billions of tons of plastic waste dumped every year into the environment. A lot of it ends up in the world ocean, and obviously it can travel anywhere, it can end up anywhere, and the impacts can manifest pretty much everywhere. So we are talking about very large scale, about truly global planetary scale environmental harms. But obviously the threat does not end with just the scale. So it's not just the space, if you'd like. So it's not just transboundary being an issue. It's also the issue of transtemporal, because these environmental harms are cumulative in their nature and they just simply transcend time. Now, let's just say with climate change, the impacts of climate change that we have now are obviously not the result of the emissions that we have here and now, but rather they are the result of cumulative emissions that have obviously accumulated in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So we're looking at more than 200 years. When we look at, let's just say, imagine that we could all of a sudden end all emissions here and now, we would still be feeling the impacts of climate change for many, many decades, because obviously all those emissions that have already accumulated. Again, the same thing, the same principle applies to plastics, because we dump plastic into the environment and it just simply stays there, like let's just say the world ocean stays there for decades, for centuries, maybe even for thousands of years. So we are dealing with transboundary and obviously transtemporal environmental harms, and it's now much more difficult to pinpoint and to say that, okay, this particular body, this particular entity, this particular polluter is responsible for those particular impacts that a certain individual or certain communities feel. So it's now much more difficult, in other words, to draw this clear link between the origins of the harm, the source of the harm, and the actual impacts of the harm, which raises quite a few challenges with respect to the application of human rights mechanisms. But obviously that's not all, because when we talk about those global environmental harms, be it climate change, be it plastic pollution, there's also one very significant aspect of those harms, and that aspect is that, well, these different harms tend to feed into each other. Okay, they tend to magnify, they tend to amplify the risks posed by each other. Now, take, for instance, plastic pollution. How do we produce plastics? Well, we produce plastics by extracting fossil fuels, right? So obviously in the process we contribute to climate change. Whilst we end using those plastics, we discard them, and what happens that either it goes into the environment where it can harm animals, where it can end up in food chain and obviously harm our own health, or it can be potentially recycled, maybe it can be, let's just say, incinerated, and then also contribute to air pollution or water pollution. Plus, also, if you live in urban areas and residential areas, plastic waste can also clog the drains, and this can be a real issue during heavy rains, during floods, particularly in areas that are already prone to flooding, because obviously if you have clogged drainage, it means that it will be much less resilient, and there's a greater likelihood that the floods could have a greater impact. And do I need to remind of the fact that floods themselves are becoming more extreme and more frequent because of climate change? So you can clearly see how different elements, those different global environmental harms just feed into each other and make each other's impacts worse. So that is the reason why some of you may have been hearing this phrase, the triple planetary crisis, for some time now, obviously coming from the United Nations as well. And this is a very accurate description of what's going on, the state of global environment, that essentially we live in the age of the triple planetary crisis, namely climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, which are all transboundary, which are all transtemporal, and which feed into each other, thus making the impacts worse. So now we come to the point of asking, well, what should we do about it? Who should be the one dealing with all this? And one thing that immediately comes to your mind is to say, well, the international community should be dealing with this. This is the task for the international community, because at the end of the day, we have a very obviously a global problem, a global challenge, a global crisis that is, well, caused globally, and therefore, accordingly, it should be dealt with globally by the international community. So it sounds good, but obviously we need to keep in mind of the fact that when we say international community, we don't mean some kind of unitary approach. We don't mean complete unity. We don't mean the same one and the same voice. We mean lots and lots of different countries, lots of different communities, even within those countries that have very different interests, very different stakes, like in terms of economy, in terms of maybe demographics, in terms of politics, and in terms of um, development, and all those different countries, all those different communities, they may pull the blanket into different directions, and then you end up with a pretty much dysfunctional international response. Now, just to give an example, let's just say climate change. There has been international law in place for more than 30 years, but look at the rates of greenhouse gas emissions. They keep rising, right? So even despite the fact that we have international law in place for more than 3 decades, we still have the rise in emissions. So it has been unable to prevent them from rising altogether, let alone stopping them. A similar thing is happening elsewhere. You look at, let's just say, biodiversity laws, all kinds of conventions, all kinds of international treaties that specifically focus on protecting biodiversity, preserving biodiversity, and yet at the same time, we see that there was still a drastic decline in biodiversity all around the globe. You look at other things, let's just say plastic pollution, and it's even worse because there isn't even any cohesive international legal framework. It's only now that the very first, what is expected to be the first international treaty on plastic pollution currently being drafted, but obviously it's still too early to say what exactly will this treaty do and what the impacts of the treaty would be. It's just simply still very early to tell. So essentially, we are looking at, like I said, at clearly insufficient international efforts. And this brings us to the point, well, who should be the one dealing with it? Well, obviously, it's up to the national authorities. The national authorities are the first line of defense, the first ones who have this, the entities that have the unique ability to regulate pollution within their territory, and obviously to take relevant measures to address this pollution. And in fact, that's where you might look at the history of different claims against different countries, and that's where you can see different individuals, different non-governmental organizations, particularly environmental non-governmental organizations, bringing claims against their national authorities in domestic court. For example, here you have the US Supreme Court, or let's just say to international courts, such as, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, and you try to make them accountable for either allowing the pollution to go on or actively taking measures, actively taking steps that make things worse. And obviously this happens quite often because when those individuals and when those non-governmental organizations try to talk to their governments, the governments may not always listen, and in fact, it happens quite often. So that's when they may end up going to courts and bringing those claims. And that's when they can use those different human rights instruments. But obviously there are all kinds of different instruments that are available at international level. And when I say international, I mean something that is, well, certain measures like, let's just say, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that are truly international, or you may look at some more regional instruments, such as, let's just say, the European Convention on Human Rights or the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, and obviously all kinds of domestic human rights mechanisms, usually enshrined in national constitutions, sometimes in some countries, maybe even in subnational constitutions when we talk about federal countries. But the fact remains that there are all kinds of different human rights mechanisms, and you can use those mechanisms when you try to go and challenge the inaction or sometimes action that leads to worse pollution by your national authorities. So what I did in this book was that I focused on 4 key regulatory areas that are essential when you want to deal with any environmental crisis, not just climate change, not just plastic pollution, not just biodiversity loss, but in fact with any environmental issue. So these are obviously environmental, overarching environmental policies. And when I say overarching environmental policies, I mean something that covers all the network, everything that you can think about. And I'll talk about this in a moment. Then going slightly more specific environmental standards and targets, that's the numerically expressed aspirations to, for example, reduce certain levels of pollutants, bans and restrictions when you obviously ban specific harmful substances, for example, and finally, environmental impact assessment when you want to assess the environmental impact of certain activity, of certain project, or a certain policy. And like I said, these 4 regulatory areas, now I'm not saying that these are the only ones, but these are the ones that are very, very common, and they are commonly used in respect to different environmental problems. And these 4 key regulatory areas are the ones that I have focused on in this book. So here are the main findings, the main things that that have emerged as part of this analysis. So obviously, when it comes to overarching environmental policies, like I said, we're talking about the network of different laws. We're talking about the network of different instruments that we can use to tackle a certain environmental problem. Now, let's focus for a moment on climate change. What could this overarching environmental policy and climate change include? Well, let's just say dealing with deforestation. Okay, promoting reforestation, promoting renewable energy, reducing greenhouse gases, obviously, setting proper standards for fuel efficiency. Now, these are just some examples. It's by no means a comprehensive list, but it's just some examples that of the things that come under the umbrella of this overarching environmental policy. So what happens in cases like this is that you go to your courts, whether to your domestic court or you go to your international court, and you try to challenge the inefficiency of your government when dealing, rather than setting this overarching environmental policy. Maybe you think it's not ambitious enough, maybe you think that it does not even exist, but the fact remains that you challenge this very broad, this very wide network of things. And what can happen in those cases, and what has happened in those cases, at least in some of those cases, in particular in North American countries like the US and countries like Canada, was that courts are extremely cautious when it comes to such claims because they feel that it's simply impossible for courts to properly deal with such matters, because when we talk about overarching environmental policy, effectively we mean the realm of legislative and executive powers. Essentially, we're talking about something that political branches should arguably be dealing with. And that's the reason, like I said, that's the reason why so many courts, particularly in North America, feel that this is something that they should not be dealing with. They should not try to scrutinize those overarching environmental policies, because that would violate the principle of separation of powers. Again, this is not necessarily unique. Such claims are not unique to North America. Elsewhere, in some other countries, they have been much more successful. For example, if we're looking at South Asia, countries like India, countries like Pakistan, then in those countries, such claims have indeed been much more successful. But the reason behind this is that in those countries, the way how the role of courts is constitutionally defined is slightly different, and courts may have this constitutional mandate to scrutinize those overarching policies and, where necessary, order the governments to take specific steps. But this is not, like I said, this is not something that is universally accepted, and it it is a place in South Asia, in some South Asian countries, but it's not a universal thing. And courts in many other countries, for example, here in Europe, the courts would most likely not be particularly keen on altering the respective governments to do something with respect to those overarching environmental policies. But that said, the whole idea of challenging obviously overarching environmental policies with human rights instruments, it may seem ideal simply because in order to deal with such a global challenge as, let's just say, climate change, that's when you need to strike at the heart of the problem. And the heart of the problem is obviously the legitimacy of all those different things that contribute to climate change. So obviously you may think that in order to tackle all this, you need to go after pretty much everything. You need to move forward with a challenge to overarching environmental policy. And if you do, obviously human rights would be the pretty much the only available avenue that you might have. Okay, moving forward. Or rather, I should say, moving into something more narrow and more specific, environmental standards and targets in other regulatory areas. Now, when we talk about environmental standards and targets, like I said, we focus on numerically expressed aspirations, numerically expressed goals. Like, let's just say we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage. And again, those cases are quite common. In fact, one of those cases was done up on the famous Agenda case against the Netherlands. And I must say that those cases tend to be much more successful. Well, the claimants in those cases tend to be much more successful. I guess there were various reasons for that. One of them is that, well, it's not some kind of very broad network of law that is being challenged, but rather a very specific number, a very specific percentage. And that specific number or specific percentage typically tends to be enshrined in a law. So it's not that you're challenging some kind of a broader policy, but like I said, normally a specific act, or rather even something within the act, which is exactly what happened in Agenda. Again, you might think that such cases would be instrumental simply because a lot of different environmental problems have those numerically expressed standards and targets as the cornerstone. Like a case of climate change is obviously the reductions of greenhouse gases. When you talk about certain other things, like let's just say air pollution, again, is reduction of certain types of pollutants in the air. It can also be instrumental in things such as plastic pollution when you want to, for example, set a certain target for recycling. So those can be really, really instrumental, and at the same time, those types of claims can be more viable. Now, speaking of plastics, one example that human rights-based litigation involving plastics can teach us a lot about concerns the third regulatory area, namely bans and restrictions. Now, when I say bans and restrictions, essentially I mean various regulatory measures that impose obviously certain bans or certain restrictions on certain types of products. Like in the case of plastics, these might be single-use plastic products, like let's just say certain types of plastic bags, maybe certain types of single-use plastic containers, plastic bottles, plastic food wraps, and so forth. And many such measures have been challenged, but not by individuals, not by environmental, non-governmental organizations, but rather by the industry itself. So this is, in fact, quite unique that many, including many human rights claims, have been brought by the industry. Because what happens in those cases, that the industry normally says, well, by introducing those bans and restrictions, the government is infringing our right to carry out business. And the right to carry out business is also quite universal. It's also recognized pretty much everywhere. But what usually happens in those cases is that courts typically tend to say that, well, even if the government actually infringes the right to carry out business, it does so because it wants to protect other rights, namely maybe the right to life, maybe the right to a healthy environment, but essentially those rights that specifically require rather environmental preservation. So in those cases, the courts balance environmental rights and business rights, and in most cases, those environmental rights turn to outweigh those business rights. So that is an important lesson that these cases can really teach. And finally, the final category of cases that I explored in this book concern cases focusing on environmental impact assessment. Now, a curious category, because when we talk about environmental impact assessment, the first thing that comes to your mind are individual projects, okay? When you want to, let's just say if you want to expand a coal mine, or if you want to build a new factory, or let's just say you want approval to perform oil exploration activities, you normally seek some kind of environmental approval, okay? In other words, permit. And as part of that environmental approval, you seek, you need to have environmental impact assessment. And because we're talking about individual projects, let's just say individual coal mines, individual power plants, you might think that, well, how do you prove that this one single coal mine or this one individual power plant can cause any human rights violations when it contributes to something that huge, that massive, that global as, let's just say, climate change or plastic pollution? So you might think that those claims will be unsuccessful. And indeed, there have been examples of such claims being unsuccessful, simply because the courts would say, well, there's really no way to properly examine whether this individual plant or whether this individual mine would actually contribute to this, well, the climate change or plastic pollution, and therefore there's no way to find out whether there has actually been any human rights violation. But that said, there have also been examples of successful cases, including sometimes when it's not just the assessment of individual projects that is being scrutinized, but rather certain laws or certain policies that concern environmental impact assessment, and where the impact might actually be much more significant. So let's just say some examples of such cases in the US, at the state level, for example, the state of Hawaii, where claimants have successfully challenged environmental impact assessment legislation on constitutional rights grounds. Okay, so moving towards the end. So the book analyzes the case law from over 30 jurisdictions. But that said, when I finished writing the book, I just felt that, well, there were still so many questions remaining. And obviously, my overall conclusions is that, yeah, those different human rights mechanisms are viable. They can be used to challenge different types of action, different types of inaction, if you like. And it's extremely likely that we'll see more of those right-based claims pretty much everywhere all around the globe. And also, I would say that we are heading towards practice of bringing more diverse claims. In other words, claims that are not just the ones related to overarching environmental policy or, let's just say, or environmental impact assessment, or maybe environmental reduction targets, or maybe bans or restrictions, but more diverse set of scenarios that can contribute to those different elements of the triple planetary crisis. Plus, we can also see a wider scope, potentially a broader circle of rights that could be used in such cases, because for now, most such cases have been, well, mostly have employed either the right to life, well, mostly focused on, I should say, either around the right to life or the right to a healthy environment, but we may see a broader spectrum of rights being used in the future. And one particular thing that I would highlight is also potentially more claims could be brought against businesses, and I would be particularly keen to hear Sara's views on this, because again, businesses obviously play a crucial role in addressing in obviously either preserving or exacerbating the state of the environment, and that's why we may see more and more claims against businesses, even though that said, when it comes to businesses, obviously businesses are not bound in the same way by human rights instruments as governments are, but nonetheless we may see greater numbers of such claims. So yeah, so that's pretty much for me. These are the key points that I just wanted to make. Thank you so much, and I very much look forward to Sarah's comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. Indeed, the international community has such a huge task ahead of them. Very interesting to hear, and question actually of how public and private actors are reacting to these crises. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your analysis and findings with us. I'd like to remind the audience now here today that there's a Q&A box at the bottom, and if you have any comments or questions, please write in that chat box, and we will come to those shortly. But first, we will turn to our expert discussant with us today, Professor Sara Seck, for her thoughts and reflections. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this conversation and the opportunity to, in particular, review this book. For myself, I was particularly eager to read what Sam had put together here because I've written and thought about climate justice issues for quite a long time, previously focusing more on the extractive sector more generally, mining companies and responsibilities in that regard. And then more recently focused in on plastics. At the invitation of the UN Environment Program, I researched with a team and developed some training materials on a human rights-based approach to the plastics value chain. And I found that work to be incredibly informative and provocative in a sense for me. It made me really think about the importance of not siloing conversations about ecological challenges such as climate change and plastic pollution, the real importance of having these conversations about how to think about these problems together, as well as, and of course, using this sort of triple planetary crisis, the idea of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and waste being interconnected challenges, which all have grave implications for human rights, and particularly certain people who are more at risk of rights violations depending on the context. So through that lens, I was really eager to see what this book manages to achieve, because its aim is very much to bring these conversations together. And so Sam has taken you through the structure of the book, and this is, I think, there are many different ways that a book like this could be structured, but the structure here does seem to work well and flow well. And the many cases that are examined here, I think, also are very revealing. What I took from this and found the most valuable and interesting was the way in which the book and the examination of the specific cases in the book really illuminates the fact that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the human rights and environment relationship more broadly is understood very differently in different parts of the world. And so in the Canadian context, we're sort of stuck with our government having, our federal government having endorsed the UN Declaration, the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Yet at the same time made a statement that it doesn't really understand what it means, that there isn't a global consensus on what its meaning is. And you see that revealed also if you take a look at the submissions the different states have made to the International Court of Justice's Climate Advisory opinion deliberations. Again, very different understandings. And this is, I think, the real richness of this book, is the way in which that comes out. So I think this is profoundly important. In the North American context, in the common law context, there tends to be much more of a sense that humans are over here, the environment is over here. And so when we're talking about a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, or however it's framed, this is somehow a mismatch. In other country contexts, what becomes very clear from, again, the cases that are described here, and this is particularly in Latin America, but in other places as well, the human is understood very much as embedded in ecological systems. So the human-environment relationship, the understanding of the human is very different. It's not the bounded autonomous liberal man who's in the box and doesn't, is self-sufficient all by themselves. It's the human that is very dependent on and interconnected with ecological relationships. And that, I think, is one of the most important things that needs to be grappled with as we seek solutions for triple planetary crisis problems. So the starting point of that conversation is very much illuminated in this book in select cases. And I found that to be the most incredibly valuable sort of contribution here. There were questions that came out, though, also as I went through. And of course, this, I will say first, congratulations for completing the book and publishing the book. It's not the longest book. It's not a short book. It's a good size. But of course, this also leads to all of the things that could have been included for the book that was twice or three times as long as what you actually produced. So here are the things that I wondered about as I was going through, and there are quite a few of them. One is, you made the comment in the presentation now, and this comes out very much in the bans and restrictions chapter in particular, that there is this right to carry out business and that nobody questions it. I actually don't know where that right comes from and what it is, and you don't actually tell me that in the book. And I'm saying this as a Canadian where we are, I think, quite an outlier because we do not have a constitutionalized right to property. We also don't have a constitutionalized right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But the tendency seems to be to talk about environmental rights without also grappling with how is a right to property or economic rights or something like this understood. And so for me, there were references in this chapter to the idea that some constitutions have some version of a right to carry out business, but the text of those wasn't provided, and I didn't feel like I had a real opportunity to grapple with what that actually means. And I think it's fundamental, right? In the Canadian context, again, it's not in our Constitution. That doesn't mean that we don't generally compensate for some version of regulatory expropriations, but there's a lot of tension as to what that actually means. And in teaching environmental law in two quite different parts of the country, I've had conversations with my environmental law students as to, do you understand that public environmental rights underlie private economic rights? Or do you understand private property rights as coming first before public environmental regulation? And what I found is my students at quite diverse law schools actually come to the table with very different understandings of which one comes first. So I think that is a sort of a fundamental piece that really needs to be further developed. What does it mean? I actually was quite surprised to see you sort of placing a right to carry out business as sort of equal to and opposing a right to a healthy environment. That framing just seemed strange to me. But again, in different contexts, maybe that is how this tends to be talked about. And so I wanted to know more about that. And this, of course, relates to, another thing that's missing is the international investment law dimensions the ability of foreign investors to sue when for, regulatory expropriations and all of that. The fact that sort of US constitutional understandings of a right to property is embedded in a lot of trade regimes and therefore gets imposed even on countries, that don't actually have that kind of property rights protections in their constitutions. Another piece of that was sort of missing or underexplored is how to think about Indigenous rights in these contexts. And again, in the Inter-American system, there was brief mention of the fact that right to property has informed Indigenous rights claims in some contexts. What turns on collective claims and the acceptance of collective claims, I think, is another piece. So when I was saying that one of the richnesses was this sense that the human is understood differently and its relationship with the environment is understood differently in different parts of the world, that also links to the idea, I think, that in some parts of the world, collective rights and collective rights in relation to the environment are much more broadly accepted, even if it is not a collective claim by a particular group, such as an Indigenous, a group of Indigenous peoples. So there's more, I think, that can go into that and that I wondered about. A couple of other things that came to mind as I was sort of grappling with this. I'll now sort of have two final kind of reflections on this. One is, as you were writing this book, you have these sort of categories, and then you have put cases in that exist into the different categories. But of course, the result of that has been that the policies chapter is largely focused on climate issues. The standards and targets includes greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation. Then when you move to the bans and restrictions, there's a lot on plastics, and renewable energy comes up in a few places. But what would happen if, instead of looking at the existing claims and even the existing laws, we were to turn our minds to what are the possible ways in which different types of laws could be used to address some of the challenges? So one example I often give is, isn't it curious that in a time of planetary crisis, including climate change, nobody in at least Western democracies seems to think it's possible to propose a ban on private jets and private yachts? Why don't we just park them for 20 years while we figure this out? Why is that not a ban that seems possible? We're banning, there are examples of countries which ban plastic bags and try to, hear lots of litigation. But nobody's even talking about parking affluent, egregiously greenhouse gas and other ecologically harmful, affluent acquisitions. Why is it that we can't have that conversation? So that's something I wonder about all the time. And then the final comment I'll make is it's in the bans and restrictions chapter, I think, again, that you start to sort of illuminate some of this pro and anti-regulatory action. I think, again, there's lots of anti-regulatory action in the climate context, and it sort of also links up. But it's important not to see challenges to renewable energy, for example, as necessarily anti-regulatory. There's a sense every now and then that perhaps there wasn't clarity on what's the difference, or is there a difference? Can we distinguish between anti-regulatory action and responsible regulatory actions, right? So and this, I think, gets back to this overarching problem. If we just look at, green energy solutions or green energy proposals as climate solutions, we're missing the triple planetary crisis aspect that's so essential, because a solution for climate change could be destructive of biodiversity and could create more pollution and waste. And so it's super important at the outset to be looking at all of those together, and to not assume that a group that is opposed to a particular regulatory action is necessarily on the wrong path. And I'm not suggesting that you do assume that, but every now and then I worried a little bit that there was sort of a threat of that. Which then, as a final note, leads me to the current context. there's, yet another Trump executive order came down yesterday. And I think this one is one that states that, the federal government is sort of instructed to oppose any challenges to challenge state actions that are being brought against what is seen as the Trump energy security agenda. This includes any states that are now taking action by setting up sort of fossil fuel accountability regimes in the climate context, the Superfund kind of model, and includes other kinds of initiatives to bring responsibility. And I'm not sure what to say about that, except that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, if you were writing this today, what would be different? And I mean, there's a big conversation to be had there, but congratulations on this book. I think it's very thought-provoking, and I look forward to your further work in this area.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah. Emily, shall I respond?
Yes, yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Sarah. Once again, these are absolutely brilliant comments, and I should probably say that when I was writing it, even before I started writing it, the main challenge was obviously how to bring those different elements of the triple planetary crisis under the same umbrella. And I must confess that just simply felt like some kind of a methodological nightmare, because I just so many times when I just woke at night and I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? Because you have cases that are completely different, deal with issues that seemingly are completely different. But that's exactly when your point, what you said at the very beginning, that we should not extrapolate, we should not just think about them as something different, because these are all parts of the same process. Now, let's just say we produce, let's just say, the same private jets. Okay, private jets. I mean, that's the result of our lifestyle, the result of lifestyle of certain people. When you talk about the fact that we dump billions and billions of tons of plastic waste, well, that's also the result of pretty much our economic activity, because let's just say 200 years ago, it was not a problem, it was not an issue. It is an issue now. So if it's an issue now, and you have those different symptoms like climate change, which is obviously the consequence, it's both the cause and the consequence, obviously, because the cause, it causes, let's just say maybe it contributes to biodiversity loss, but at the same time, it's also the consequence of how we live, and the consequence of, obviously, our post-industrial revolution lifestyle. And it's exactly the same when it comes to biodiversity loss, exactly the same when it comes to plastic pollution. I should probably even say that biodiversity loss is probably historically should be the first where our contribution has made the greatest impact, because I think so many species that we have just completely exterminated, and it happened even before, I think, the Industrial Revolution, but then obviously came the Industrial Revolution, so okay, now we use fossil fuels, and that's when we also at some point stopped producing plastics and dumping them. So yeah. The main challenge was obviously how to bring all this together in one book, and that's where, for example, I thought that, okay, certain things, like let's just say how to balance business rights and how to balance environmental rights. This was a massive issue, because this was a massive issue in case of plastics, but maybe not so much in case of climate change, because normally when you think about anti-regulatory action and climate change, it's normally not based in human rights. So that was that is something that immediately came to my mind. The reason why I did not focus that much on business rights was because I guess that would have probably been a bit more difficult methodologically, I would say, and I just simply tried to make it as less difficult as it could have been. But I clearly see your point, and this is actually something that I thought about when I was writing. Okay, so I'm talking a lot about those different business rights, and they may not even be called right to carry out business. It may be called like the right to carry out trade, or the right to commerce, or the right to even I think in some countries it was like simply right to work, something that basic. But I thought, okay, if I talk about it in detail, I would need to put it also. I would also need to talk about it in much more detail in the chapter when I talk about the human rights instruments. And that would mean that I talk about those different instruments. Yeah, exactly. Those instruments that are meant to protect, well, interests related to the environment versus those mechanisms that are meant to protect private property interests. And obviously, these are simply completely different, okay, because these are different interests at stake. So that is the reason why I thought, okay, I will just include it there. I will make reference to specific articles. Those readers who are interested in this, they can go and check and perhaps do further research. Yeah, and personally, I also felt that this those different interpretations of the right to a healthy environment, I completely agree that I found it to be very fascinating because you may seem that you have a right that is, well, the same. But then again, in countries like Mexico and Colombia, well, it's actually not the same because the right to a healthy environment also means that you protect nature as such. And this is very different from, let's just say, some other countries, some European countries where, like, let's just say Norwegian courts may even say, well, what exactly is this right? What does it involve? And where you may have, again, countries where this right is not even explicitly recognized, it's unwritten, like in Ireland, where courts might say, we don't even understand its meaning, so therefore we may not even need it if it does not extend any other ways. So you're absolutely right, and this is something I've been thinking about, and hopefully I just keep my fingers crossed that obviously the UN resolution and all those steps at the UN level will hopefully help bring this greater clarity and hopefully to make this line perhaps more streamlined. Though that said, I might also see certain benefits of having certain more localized interpretations of this right that are specifically more unique to certain specific places, where you might say that the right to a healthy environment is more focused, let's just say maybe on protection of water resources, because, well, protection of water resources may be a big issue. Elsewhere, it might be protecting the rights of nature, because that's a big issue of concern. But obviously, I completely agree. It would be a really good thing to have more streamlined interpretation of this right, where you would have a certain, at the very least, basic standard at the international level, and you could not go below it. Now, you may decide to go above it in light of your specific circumstances, but there is a certain minimum that you should not drop below. Yeah, so this is the right to healthy environment. What else? Yeah, so going back to, I think, those indigenous claims and collective rights, again, one of the things that I did not look in detail, again, because I just simply did not find any cases with respect to plastics where such claims could work. And even in case of climate change, I think mainly those cases were I think, to the best of my knowledge, is the petition I think brought before the UN Special Rapporteurs in the US. I think that is the key petition to what I know. But also some other petitions involving indigenous interests, like let's just say in Billy versus Australia. I thought that they could be more related to the right to culture. And again, this is something that I talked about in the context of potential future claims, where you can see more and more such claims happening in the future. So at some point, I just decided, okay, I will mention it, that this is something relevant, that this could happen more in the future, but I will not look at it in detail now, because then I will just simply completely get blown away. Speaking of potential solutions, this is a really good one. This is an absolutely brilliant point. And yeah, I mean, when you think about it, normally when you think about that, we're dealing with the triple planetary crisis. We need something here and now. We need urgent steps, active steps, like maybe we're banning private jets, we're taking other measures, we are critically revising our use of plastics. But no, it seems that international community is much more interested in certain other things. It's much more interested in AI, which I personally haven't seen so far delivering any critical benefits to the environment. It's just simply more technology on more technology and more technology. So just adding all those layers of technology, and it just simply doesn't seem to provide a solution.
If I could add, it is a huge energy user.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, in BlackRock's recent statement, it is saying that it does not see an end to fossil fuels because with the energy intensive tech sector, there will not be enough renewable energy to go around. And so that's another piece that I think is there is again an acceptance that AI is just going to be used, but that acceptance comes with a huge ecological cost in terms of the energy needs, and that seems to be something I think that's also quite absent from the discussions right now. And I don't think it's very well known.
Yeah. No, it's not. And obviously with AI, also all those things like all those cryptocurrencies and everything, all those things that essentially cause even more pollution. That when you think about it, well, it's not. It doesn't cause pollution in itself, but then the fact that it relies on energy, it needs energy, and energy doesn't come from thin air. Okay, so it's mostly it's from fossil fuels. Again, when you think about plastics. Now, I hear some discussions about potentially introducing some plastics-consuming bacteria into the world ocean, but I don't see any systemic efforts to, even clean up, just try to apply as much as possible, just even some basic physical measures of cleaning up, nor some kind of systemic discussion on how to stop all this production in the first place, because you produce and it may end up. And even, in fact, if you look at some of those cases, then the courts said, well, the best way to stop pollution is just simply to ban it. Not to introduce levies, not to introduce taxes, not to limit it, but simply to ban it, because that's the most effective way. If it's not there, then it will not be released into the environment. And instead, technology, the world is just insanely on this technology needle. Military, I mean, we're still so much engaged in military conflicts everywhere. It drains so much energy, it drains people, it drains everything, and it's also environmentally harmful. It's also contributing obviously to this crisis. So I just simply don't see, and I completely agree, why is it that the possible solutions are either not on the table or they're not being discussed to the extent that normally you would expect them to be discussed. So this is a huge disappointment, and I completely agree with it. I just simply don't understand. I just simply feel that the way how we're moving forward as an international community is very ineffective, because we're just simply not addressing the elephant in the room, just exactly the same way that we don't want to see that those different of the triple planetary crises are not something completely isolated. These are all parts of the same problem. Exactly the same way, for some reason, we do not seem to have the appetite to have the discussion that, okay, here and now, we need to make some really drastic measures, and because that's what is necessary. I don't know, Sarah, whether this answers.
I think again, there's much to discuss, but at least the conversation about how to bring these issues together rather than seeing them separately has very definitely begun in your book, and we'll keep pondering the future.
Thank you so much.
Indeed. Well, thank you both for an amazing conversation to have been a part of. We'll move to the Q&A quickly. I know we're over time slightly, so we just have, I think, one question from Clements for both of you, if you want. To go, let's see. You're welcome to read them yourself, but I will read them to you as well. Have there been any court cases using human rights approaches to challenge governments in the case of inaction in front of interstate climate-induced displacements? Could human rights mechanisms help to create an official status for climate refugees? so their rights could be protected and their specific needs recognised and met on the international level.
Yeah, shall I go for it? Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a real brilliant point that you bring forward the question of climate refugees, because I actually, in this last chapter of the book, I specifically talked about how those cases concerning climate displacement could become more, I wouldn't say mainstream, because they already exist. And in fact, one of the most known case before the International Human Rights Committee was obviously TTO versus New Zealand, which specifically focused on climate displacement. But again, climate displacement raises all kinds of issues, because whether you're talking about claims brought by individuals who are seeking asylum, or you're talking about those states that themselves disappear, and there has been an initiative. I don't know, Sarah, whether you happen to know like what stage, because obviously those small Pacific nations that brought their claim before the International Court of Justice a couple of years ago. It was not. Sarah, do you know the stage? Do you know what stage this?
I actually recall hearing of it, but I have not heard about it recently. So I don't know what stage it's at.
Yeah.
I do think the conversation about, you know, how to, this is very definitely an important conversation. I co-edited a book a couple of years ago on climate loss and damage, where we were trying to look at loss and damage through the lens of different areas of law, which included a human rights focus chapter, but also included one that was looking at it through, you know, a refugee and migration law perspective. And I think there is and will be many cases that are raised, but there are going to be many challenges associated with it, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, definitely. I completely agree. And I myself, I haven't looked at those cases that specifically, well, not the cases, but rather those initiatives that specifically involve countries considering action against other countries in the context of climate change. But I do know those initiatives exist, and obviously the also the opinion on the climate change in the context of the law of the sea, the one that was issued by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea last year. So it's obviously, I think there is a constant build-up where we will see more and more such claims, and where this issue will become more prominent, because obviously as certain parts of the globe that are currently inhabited are facing very real threats of going underwater, then the question is what's going to happen next? Well, we can't really wait what's going to happen next. We should address this issue here and now to decide what's going to happen to those communities. So yeah, it's absolutely something that should be part of the discussion.
Well, thank you everyone at home as well. That does bring us to time. And just to say, if you want to rewatch any of this or share it with a colleague who you know would find interesting as well, this will be on YouTube in the coming days and on our website. So thank you very much, Sam and Sarah, for your thoughts today. And well, good afternoon.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.